So before I start to reassemble my shift forks and rods back into the case, I need to make sure that this detent right here, this is an interlock detent, connects through both holes. So what I'm going to do is, if I lift it right here, it should move freely and we should see it appear over on this side. Now if you have, the only way you can get this detent out is you need to remove this plug right here. And this is a press fit into the case. Usually there's not any reason to take this out unless there is a problem. But the other thing you have to make sure is sometimes this detent can get stuck up in, there's a bore up in here during the cleaning process. So we want to make sure it's working between the two shift rods. And the purpose of this is so you cannot select two gears at once. So when one shaft is in, it blocks the other shaft from moving. So now I've got my gear sets all loosened up. What I need to do is I need to pull my gear set back. This is the shift fork that we didn't crack loose at all when we pulled the transmission apart. It needs to be on that first second selector and then lined up into the hole. So all I'm going to do is pull my assembly back, slide my shift fork on, and I want to make sure that it slides into that hole. Just want to make sure that our steel shims don't get pinched. And then we could just slide that whole assembly back into that test. And I just want to make sure everything seats in and this selector should move freely. To the third, fourth selector, I've got the selector fork on and the little shift part right here, which is going to be set up here. We'll set this up when we set up the selectors. I've just got them started enough so I can slide my selector fork over. Then I want to slide the shift rod into the case, but you see there's two cutouts on it, one here and one here. I have to make sure that one is facing this detent right here and the other one is facing the interlock pin. And I'm just going to slide these pieces in and just let it sit there for right now. So these two holes right here are our shift detents, and this is what they look like. We've got springs and two detents. These detents are going to press against the shift forks, or shift rod, sorry, and that's going to help hold that rod in place. It's also going to give you that feedback when you're shifting in the car when it actually locks into gear. So I've just dropped the detent in with the spring, and then we just need to put the plugs on the back side to locate these shift rods. So I've got my little cap, and I'm just going to drop the aluminum washer that we got out of our seal kit. Then we're going to be pushing against the spring tension, and sometimes what will help is if I move the shift rod around a little bit until I feel it lock into place. Then I just want to hold some tension down on top of this and screw it in. Okay. Now I can feel here, before the shift rod would move easily, I can feel that that detent is guarded. And if we look at this one as I move it, you see how the detent spring is popping up and down? That's because it's pressing on those little recessed pieces that we were looking at on that shift rod. We've already got the aluminum seal ring. Now we just need to torque these down. So these are a really short threaded bolt, and especially into the magnesium case, you've got to be very careful. The torque range is 15 to 18 newton meters, but you still want to pay attention when you're torquing it down. If anything feels funny, just stop. That one torque nicely. Perfect. Next thing we need to do is move our shift forks until they line up with the grooves in the shaft. So if we look down, you can see I'm going to rotate the shaft a little bit. We need to make sure it's in that adjustable range on both of them. So I've got a wave washer on the brass one, and on the steel one it uses the lock style or the split ring washer. Right now we're just going to leave these loose. I'm just going to bring them in finger tight. So before I can adjust my shift forks, I need to use my mandrel. This is going to locate on each of these bearings, and then it's going to hold those shift forks, because as you can see there's a lot of wiggle, and if we're adjusting as I move that fork or that shift rod in and out, it moves the fork position. So we need to use one of these, which is just going to hold everything into position for us. So when I'm going to go and adjust my shift forks, what I'm looking for, you see how much movement I have here? I want to make sure that I set the slider right in the middle of the two gears. If I have it set all the way to one side, it's going to shorten up the throw to, this is third gear right here, and it's also going to drag on that Synchro, which is going to wear it out prematurely. If it was set all the way over here up against fourth gear, the same thing's going to happen. So I want to make sure that I'm set right in the middle, and then I'm going to torque this bolt down to 25 Newton meters, which is going to lock that shift fork to the shift rod. So I've adjusted the slider so it's in the center of the two gears, and I've nipped it down. All I'm going to do now is just do the final torque on it. Then, even though we didn't touch the first gear adjustment, the last person in the transmission, it is centered too far back towards first gear. So I'm going to loosen this one off and readjust it. Now that I've recentered that one, I've just torqued it down. The last adjustment I need to make is going to be on our selector fork right here. It needs to line up perfectly so it can slide through this point. It also needs about 2 millimeters of free play in between the two shift rods, otherwise it can chatter and hit that other rod. So I've got it set. I've got an approximate 2 millimeters that you can see from this distance to here, and then I'm perfectly in line down my shift forks. So I could use a little bit of a bump forward. Okay. That way when we're rotating through the gears, the selector won't get hung up between first, second and third fork. Going to wrap up our shift fork adjustment for the intermediate part of the case. Next I'm going to put the gaskets on and slide our intermediate housing over the gear sets. So just like we did on our front case, we have another interlock pin assembly. It has right here, this is another one of these press-in plugs. You want to make sure that the check ball is all the way down inside. It can often get stuck up in here, in which case you run the risk of being able to select fifth or reverse at the same time as first and second. And this is spring loaded inside of here, so there's quite a bit of tension. You can see there's these roll pins that have a spring between them. So when you're pressing up, it's not like the other one where it's loose, it's under a lot of spring pressure. The easiest way to check it is to actually grab my fifth reverse selector and work it into that hole. And as we select, I'm just going to rotate it. You can see that other lockout pin is right there, and it'll show it. And as I rotate it down back into the groove, you see how the pin retracted back in there. So now we're just going to install our gasket. These gaskets do not need any sealer as long as this surface is clean, dry, and flat. So sometimes you may have to pull these studs out and actually surface this housing depending on what kind of condition it's in. So I need to position my shift fork or my gear shift selector into the intermediate housing before I slide it in. This is because I also have to be able to locate down here. There's a pilot's hole that's going to locate. Now I can't slide this in after the housing is on, so it needs to come in, and it's going to be a little bit of a jiggle to make it fit, because I have to get everything over the gear sets, locate the shift rod into this guide pivot, and then slide the case on. As I put the case in, I still constantly turned all of my shafts, making sure everything lined up, making sure my bearings are sitting where they need to be, and nothing was bound up. I've just got this sitting in here right now. I haven't completed it. We'll roll that over in just a minute and complete where it needs to sit. So with our selector, what I'm going to do is I just want to line this up, and it's going to come through. You can see here where it's passing through the two shift rods that we set up. Next is going to be our plate. This is going to hold our pivot points, and it's also going to select the amount of range that this is going to have to move. So I just need to get my gasket on here, and we're going to slide this plate in like that so it locates. This is going to control the upwards movements back here on this selector. Once our reverse gear gets installed, that's going to control how far this can rotate this direction. So for right now, we just want to center in our shift forks. So I'm just going to slide this piece down, making sure the fork locates. So that's going to give us our pivot. So we've pretty much closed up the inside of the transmission. I've still got to just change the synchro on 5th gear, which is what I'm about to do right now. So the dog teeth on 5th gear are in really good shape. And this is also kind of attributed to maybe 5th gear doesn't get as much use, and also the transmission is working at a fairly high speed. It's a little bit easier to synchronize this gear, but these ones are perfect. No need to change. So now all we've got to do is assemble our parts back onto the back end of the transmission. We've got our 5th gear that's going to come on, and our reverse gears on both input and pinion shafts. I'm going to take my fixed gear first. I got to put the reverse idler gear supports in at the same time as I put the gear in. Next, I'm going to put my thrust washer on, followed by my gear assembly. I've already got the inner race, needle bearing loaded all as one, but you can put them on individually if you want. Then our reverse drive gear and our synchro hub last. Next, we're going to slide on our reverse idler gears. First bearing, and then there's going to be 2 needle cages, spacer, and the last needle cage. And this gear is just going to sit right here and mesh onto this one. I'm just going to start this nut for right now and leave it obviously loose so I don't forget to torque it. Last thing on the reverse idler is going to be our thrust washer. This is going to set up against the case, and in a minute we'll change this O-ring here. I'll cut it off and put a new one on. and new pinion shaft nut, just like we did when we did our pinion depth. Screw that in. So we need to tighten our input shaft nut right here and our pinion shaft nut, and then once we've tightened the pinion shaft nut, I'm going to stake it right onto that stake point. The input shaft nut uses a roll pin to secure it. So first I'm going to tighten the input shaft nut. This is 120 Newton meters. Now that I've tightened this one, I'm going to put my roll pin in just to lock that nut into place. So before I tighten my pinion shaft nut, I'm going to select fourth gear again, just like we did when we checked our pinion depth. So I've lined up the selector, and I'm just going to pull it back. When I turn my input shaft, now my pinion shaft will turn as well. So that way I can lock it up on the front using our locking tool and tighten the pinion nut. Okay, so we're going to tighten the pinion shaft nut to 240 Newton meters. So we've got everything tightened. I just need to pin my lock nut right here. And that's all it needs. So I want to put a new O-ring on here, so I'm just going to pry this one out. You see, the last person decided it needed sealant, which it doesn't. And then my new O-ring is just going to slide over that shaft like that. The only thing we're going to put on this is silicone grease to help it slide into the case. The last thing we have left is our fifth reverse slider. So I'm just going to go ahead and set the slider on. And then we're going to grab our gear selector. So I've just rolled the transaxle over so you can see a little better. We're going to slide our fifth reverse shift fork in, and then we've got to slide our selector shaft in, and there's two detents in there. So they'll take a little bit of force. I'm going to use my plastic mallet to help push past the detent because it is spring loaded. Okay. So I want to make sure that my selector, I've already pulled it out of fourth gear from tightening, but we need to make sure we're all the way in on the second detent. So when we go through our range of neutral, this little shaft, this is what selects reverse gear, should drop straight into that slot. And it should roll fairly nicely. And then we're going to adjust our shift fork the same way that we did our others on the inside. The only difference being is we just want to set the edge of our dog teeth just off the edge of the Synchro band in here. To be careful, because if you let it sit back here, see how I can pull it all the way back to the slot? There's a possibility that it can actually partially engage. So it's really important that we get close enough to the fifth gear Synchro without engaging that Synchro. Lastly, I'm just going to torque this to 25 Newton meters again. So before I put my back cover on, I'm going to install the new shift seal. These once again just go in with a little bit of silicone grease. I want to lubricate the outside of the seal, and this is only to help it slide in. Doesn't need any sealant here. And where the shift rod is going to slide, I want to lubricate that as well. Line this up, and I should be able to press this in with just my thumbs. Shouldn't need to hammer or punch it in. Before I put the case on, I want to lubricate my O-ring just with silicone grease. And also going to lubricate the case slightly here, just so it doesn't bind up as I slide it all together. So before I put the back cover on, I want to put on a new gasket. I'm going to lubricate my shift sleeve with a little bit of wheel bearing grease. Does not need a lot here, just because there's no bushing in the early magnesium case transmissions. I want to give it a little bit of extra lubrication. I want to make sure that I line up my shift fork as I come in. Be careful as it comes through that seal. And once this O-ring contacts right here, it should just nicely tap in by hand. Should not need a lot of force to tap this in. So now I'm just going to get my nuts and washers on and tighten this down to 25 Newton meters. We are also going to put our ground strap on right here, and there's also a 90-degree bracket that needs to be fitted as well. The last thing I have to do on the back here is put in my backup light switch and pin. So the pin has a taper. This pin is what's going to face the switch. There's a little tiny guide sleeve in there. I want to slide that in and then screw my backup light switch in and tighten it. So we've already set up all our differentials, so all I've got to do is put my diff assembly in. And I just want to be careful when I lower this in, so I don't drop it onto that pinion gear. And next we're going to put our cover on. So I'm just going to put on the new O-ring. I'll just make sure it's relaxed in that groove. The only thing that this needs is a little bit of silicone grease, and that's only to help it slide together on these surfaces. We don't need any sealant here whatsoever. All it does is make the job even harder for the next guy and more expensive for the owner. And we don't need a huge amount of silicone grease either, just enough to let the seal slide. So next we're going to put our clutch cable holders on and our clutch helper spring return stop points. When I tighten this down, just going to bring it down nice and even, just like we did when we checked our preloads. To do is to tighten everything, final torque, 25 Newton meters. Okay, we've got to put our diff side seals in. There's a, you can see here a slight groove, so the seal's going to sit down a little bit from the top, so if you leave them up too high, then what will happen is they'll tend to rub on the actual stub axle. Again, silicone grease only is all that's required. And we also want to lubricate the inside of the seal so it doesn't burn out against the stub axle. Just going to use my bearing and seal driver just to get the final depth. Okay, I just want to make sure it's nice and even. And what I did is I pressed the side of my seal driver over so when I tap down with my hammer, I could feel when it hit the lip on the transmission. Next I'm going to take my half shaft and just drop that in, and then I bolt with the wave washer. So we've got to tighten the bolt that holds the half shaft in. That's going to torque to 42 Newton meters. So I'm just going to bring my torque wrench up. 42. And the best way to do this is put in just 2 M8 bolts, because we need to stop the half shaft from rotating. I'm just going to use my pry bar to come in and tighten them just like that. So we need to do the same on the other side now. Just going to lubricate my seal. Should not take an overly large amount of force to get these in. If they do, then stop and see what's going on. Slide my other half shaft in. Bolt with our locking washer. So one of the last things we need to do on this transmission is reinstall our clutch forks. I'm putting a new fork in. You can see the wear that happens on these. This is fairly standard and not a big deal. It's just something that you need to replace from time to time. The new fork should look nice and radius. You can see this one's worn a flat spot. We've already inspected the bushings by just installing our shaft and checking for free play, making sure they move freely. I am going to lubricate them both here, and also right around the back here with just some wheel bearing grease before we assemble everything. You want to make sure you don't over grease this one, because you can hydraulic this bushing out. There is no air relief at the top, so just a really light amount of grease in the very top. I'm going to install my little dust seals first. First one's going to go onto the bushing stick out, and to install my release fork I need to just kind of find that sweet spot. Okay, I'm going to slide my shaft in and just engage the splines. There is no timing on this shaft, so you don't have to worry about where it is. And I want to get it just to hold that clutch fork so I can squeeze the upper seal in. I want to line my shaft up, so I'm just going to use my flashlight. There's a groove machined in the shaft for our roll pin, and then our roll pin is just going to drive in through this little hole in a clutch fork. I have both seals installed, and these are just dust seals to keep debris out of the bearing surfaces, and one more is going to go on the bottom of the shaft. And our release bearing should operate nice and smoothly. Our release arm, sorry. Our last seal is going to go on the outside here to seal up against the case to stop debris coming in. Then our clutch arm and our helper spring arm and our clutch arm will go on when the transmission's installed back into the car. So we have a new guide sleeve. We can see on this is the old one, a couple of things with this one. One, we can see where the release bearing has worn in, and you can physically feel it when you run your fingers over it. The other thing too is this one was really beat up on the bottom and on these surfaces by previous mechanics. So I opted to putting in a new one. I have the new case sealing O-ring that's just going to wrap around onto here. Then the last thing I have to install is the input shaft seal. I just need to lubricate that and I'll press that in. There's a little ridge right here where it's going to sit against, so I'm just going to press that in until it hits that ridge. And we could probably press it in from either side, doesn't matter. So when I go to press this in, I'm just going to use a socket that will hit on the little lip where it stops, and just like our other seals, I'm going to lubricate it. The important thing is the seal lip with the spring will face into the transmission. We don't want to put it in like that because otherwise oil will push straight past here and will leak into the bell housing. And that goes for all of the oil seals. The spring lip always has to face in towards the transmission. Before I install the guide sleeve, I'm going to lubricate the O-ring. And this is all this needs, no sealant here. When I slide the guide sleeve over the splines, I've got to be very careful just to make sure that it doesn't cut anything. Then I just want to line everything up. And I can feel that O-ring engage right there. And just got to put my screws in. So the last thing I need to do is just verify that I can select all the gears. So I'm going to use my little shifter that allows me to connect and shift through gears. It's just a T-handle.
How do you know what gear you're in?
I'm in first gear right now. Do you want me to say that?
Yeah.
Second gear. Third gear. Fourth gear. Fifth gear, and then finally reverse. And you can see that the axle flange is rotating the opposite direction. And that's it. That's all the gears, everything selected. Sometimes you've got to spin, especially for reverse gear. I am spinning my input shaft. I just have an old clutch hub on here, and this allows me to turn it a lot easier. Otherwise I've got to grab that shaft and rotate it. The last thing I want to do is just select reverse and make sure when I turn it that we're turning in reverse. Then use my ohm meter to check our backup light switch, which should have continuity, which it does. Then if I drop it out of reverse, we can see that the meter goes to open circuit, so our backup light switch is working.